Hello and welcome to the Safety Goals Podcast with Justin Torres and Charlie Wund, presented by Injury. This is episode 6 with our special guest, Christian Reed.
Christian is currently an insurance broker for the youth sports world, so it'll be great to hear about his expertise in this area and understanding how he sees sports safety from that lens. But he's also a youth sports parent and a former Little League commissioner in his hometown. So he's an all-around great guy, excited to be able to dive in and learn more from Christian.
Absolutely, Charlie, a fellow Arizona State man and Walter Cronkite alum. I'm going to have a lot to talk to him about. So without further ado, let's get into the show. Okay, everyone. So we are here with Christian Reed, one half of Dissinger Reed. And Christian, it's great to have you on today.
You know what, Justin? I appreciate you and Charlie reaching out, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Absolutely. So to start off, you and I actually have some similarities, as Charlie made known earlier between you and I, that we are both Arizona State alums, especially when it comes to the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication. Although I will say the program may have changed since you and I both went there, about a 20-year difference, but still I know that the standards are high as ever, and I'm trying to uphold them here today. So with that, can you just tell us, what you went about with in your journey at Arizona State?
Yeah, well, Justin, that's a great intro, and you're really making me feel old. So I thank you for that. I grew up in Southern California and wanted to have a career in sports broadcasting. So, as you well know, Arizona State has the Walter Cronkite School of Broadcast and Communications, which was number one in the country, battling Syracuse. So I was at ASU from 88 to 92, best 4.5 years of my life, other than family. And it was a great program. It really, as you know, Justin, provides some hands-on experience of whether it's broadcast journalism and TV, whether it is radio and or print. They are excellent at what they do and provided some hands-on experience for me to go start my career working for NBC Sports back in 1992. And that was great. Loved being a sportscaster, and it was a passion. And, was working in beautiful Helena, Montana, and then Chico, California. And then from there, continued in broadcasting, but I ended up leaving television and got into radio, and was working for KNBR and The Ticket, which were Susquehanna radio broadcast in San Francisco for about 8 years. So managed some sports properties, really tried to continue my love for sports and playing sports, talking sports, and then getting into sales with the San Francisco Giants, the Warriors, the Raiders, and Stanford. So it took me to San Francisco. And then, as you mentioned, Eddie Dissinger, who was my stepfather-in-law, had this small athletic insurance agency based out of Leawood, Kansas. And when I married my wife, Chrissy, we ended up taking a chance. I left radio, went out and bought this small insurance agency, which worked with colleges and universities and state high school associations, which is relevant to the youth sports market, which I know you and Charlie are heavily involved with. And we just started to build our brand. Eddie Dissinger, God rest his soul, we just lost him last year in September. And he had a great footprint for taking care of student athletes, both on the collegiate level, the State High School Association level, and really paved the way to our footprint in youth sports and what we do now for hundreds of associations across the country. So that is life. That's what I tell my kids. If you would have told me I would have been in insurance getting out of ASU in 92, I would have called you crazy. Very hard to navigate sometimes, but it really is about helping these student athletes and these kids with their journey and helping parents through insurance, which can be very discombobulated, very confusing to parents, and very confusing to associations and those ones that are tasked with providing a risk management tool for the sports that they are playing. And I love it. I mean, I could not be more passionate about college, high school, and youth sports. I have 4 children that all played and are playing sports. Love it. Coached, and now I can take that resource back to you and Charlie on, okay, really, what is the best for these students as they're participating in youth sports and high school sports and college sports, and what does that roadmap look like from a risk management, from insurance to coverage, and ultimately talking with these parents about how they navigate that when their kids are injured. And within our risk pool of insurance for the clientele that we work with, you have to have a model, and it starts with the top, and then it comes all the way down to the education with these kids, with these athletes, and a lot of times with the parents. Long-winded answer to the Arizona State to where we are now, but that's where I am.
I was going to say the broadcast journalism is gave you the foundation to be a talker. That's for sure. We got you. We got you your full story there in a nutshell. What take it back a little bit further, Christian? You made the jump from broadcast journalism, and so obviously you had a passion for sports and being around that. But what was it that I guess was so fundamentally, I guess, interesting, or what drew you to insurance other than the family biz side of it? When did you really start to uncover some of the necessary components, or how insurance was an integral part of sports in general?
Great question, Charlie. When we made the jump back in 2003 and moved the family to Kansas, it was a niche agency, and we still are, that truly only focuses on athletic insurance. It's what we do every day. And when Eddie came to me and said, "Hey, look, we insure colleges and universities, state high school associations," and that was a passion of mine. So it was a good feat, or a good lead into taking that leap of faith to say, if we are talking about kids and we're talking about insuring the college, high school, and youth sports, then that was my mission. Having kids and having the 4 kids very young, was how do we make sure that these kids are covered at any level, to the best of our ability.
I was going to ask. I was trying to think and remember. 2003 feels like it was right about the time. I remember in the NCAA basketball tournament, there was that one athlete who came down on a jumper in the corner and just completely shattered his leg. And I remember the fallout from that was that at the time, the college nor the NCAA offered any kind of insurance to cover those types of catastrophic incidents, which ended up being something like $200 and some odd $1,000 bill for that kind of surgery. And of course, I do remember at the time, though, the NCAA stepped up, or maybe it was the college, and actually took care of those costs. But that was a reform moment, right? And it was right around the same time, wasn't it?
Well, it was a few years after that, Charlie. Yeah, and I
Yeah.
think you're speaking to, he was a player at University of Louisville, and it was a compound fracture. And I think that truly, the point that you're hitting on, Charlie, is there is a ton of misinformation of what is covered and what is not covered at any one of these institutional levels, high school level, youth sports levels. It's all about education at any level. It's the NCAA at that time, Charlie, absolutely had their catastrophic plan in place. And Louisville had a base insurance plan that would cover that student athlete. I think at the time the NCAA deductible was 75,000. It's now 90,000 for any one injury that a student athlete would sustain participating on or behalf of that university. So you have the school's base plan led into the CAP plan, which from $75,000 up to 20 million would pay for that catastrophic injury. So you have a lot of the news outlets that are just uninformed, unfortunately. And I think there's some great people doing some great things, but they're writing about athletic insurance, not knowing what is behind the scenes, not knowing what's in that grinder, not knowing what the schools and the institutions have in place. The NCAA has a platform where these schools can pay for anything now. The NCAA allows them to pay for whether it's an athletic injury, a non-athletic injury. If they have the funds to do so, they can. So it's about education and communication, and that is from the college and university. The high school associations is the same way. It's whether it's a catastrophic plan and a high school student is paralyzed in a championship football game, or a regular season What does that parent do? Where do they go? What are we doing to help communicate that all the way down from the high school association to the school districts and the superintendents to the individual member schools and institutions, so they know where to go? They can ask those questions. What's in place? What does the state association have? What does the individual institution have? What does the high school have for school time activities or a catastrophic plan that would pay for something like that? So, and then into youth sports is a lot of times, we sign up our kids, they're playing soccer or youth baseball, they get hurt, hopefully not catastrophically, but we as parents that are coaching and are involved in those associations, a lot of those parents have no idea what insurance is in place for those kids while participating, whether it's Moraga Baseball Association, AYSO, they're playing, and it's like, well, what do I do? Well, you hope that they have primary insurance that will take care of, but we realize that there are a lot of socioeconomic challenged areas where there may be no primary insurance.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah. And
and
we,
what
we see that, right? I mean, we see where an athlete becomes injured or suspected concussion even, and then they never show up again for sports because they couldn't afford it or they couldn't take them to the doctor for whatever reason. And so that integral part of how insurance, I mean, it's everywhere. We know it's one of those things that it's one of those industries that is layered into our society. But that, your description of how those layers work isn't what we're thinking about when we sign our kid up for, the 10 and under AYSO soccer league, right? I mean, that's just not on
exactly.
the minds of parents. So I guess, and you talk about education too, but I guess the reality is that when we talk about the NCAA, there's definitely roles and responsibilities within those larger institutions to oversee and handle these types of mechanisms, these staples inside of their industry or for their institution. But when you talk about youth sports, and especially in the volunteer society, many of these executive directors are still in the same uninformed component because that's not what we get into being involved with sports, right? Like you, I
Yeah.
mean, you
Yeah.
you were hoping to be calling the World Series, not thinking about insurance,
Yeah.
and so I guess tell us a little bit more about that, your understanding of it. I mean, you were taught about insurance, you learned about it through the industry as you came through. So how during that process to you, what was that aha moment when you said this is something that can shape and does affect the lives of a lot of people in this sports world in the United States?
Yeah, well, it was early on, and I'll tell you, it probably was due to the rapid increase of concussions and the
Mm,
awareness of concussions in youth sports and what they were doing. And we just saw very early on, Charlie, that some of these kids, as you mentioned, were not going and having any neurological follow-up whatsoever because they couldn't afford it. For whatever reason, there may not have been insurance in place with that youth association. So we saw a lot of gaps in coverage with concussion and the coverages or limited coverages that were in place. And we saw there would be no neurological follow up. The parents, because they couldn't afford it, would not take their son or daughter back to have them reassessed because we know that that second concussion can be catastrophic.
mhm.
And Eddie just saw, there's something missing here. There's got to be some education and some coverage that can help these youth athletes across the country. And of course, when you have the participant accident coverage, which is paired with concussion coverage, obviously that leads into the general liability and the overall risk of that association. So the association, as it's known, whether it's baseball, soccer, if they don't have the proper coverage and there's a third party litigation suit against AYSO or whoever it may be, that leads to a larger issue of a class action concussion suit, which we have seen. It's then leading from the accident and the injury itself back onto, okay, what is that association doing to cover their risk? At the end of the day, it's about these kids and it's about them getting the coverage that they need and educating the associations in these youth leagues about what is out there, what can be done, and then ultimately leading back to help protecting these associations that we know do not have a lot of money. It's not a cash cow like a lot of the parents may think or whatnot. How do we protect them against these injuries that are not their fault, but it may cause some litigation back on from a third party? And what do they have to protect themselves when there's negligence possibly shown against that association? So we just saw a lot of gaps on the accident side, on the concussion side, and how that played into, number one, the coverage for the kids, but then from a risk management approach, how do we tackle that from the youth association or the high school association? What are we doing to educate our schools, educate the youth leagues on what is out there and what coverage they do have? A lot of these associations are doing some great things, and a lot of times the parents have no idea what they're doing. It's about that education and showing them what they're taking from really the risk management approach from the association all the way down to protecting the kids on a Saturday and Sunday and during the practices. So long-winded answer, but that's what we saw. We saw it with concussions. We saw it with participant accident. And we just started to build out our youth association programs via some creative programs that a lot of other carriers did not want to touch.
Yeah. And I guess you touch on education a number of times, right? How do we inform those who are liable in these sense, or the administrators of the organizations who ultimately that risk comes back to? So, what would you say your number one when you work with a new organization, a high school state association, or executive directors at the youth sports level? What's that number one value that you feel that Dissinger Reed brings to the relationship?
That's a great question. Well, it does go back to education. Our approach is we go in and we try to find out what some of their pain points may be, what they're struggling with. We know that their staffs are not large. You know, when you talk about NCAA, there's a lot of compliance. High school associations, they have to be members of that state high school. So there's compliance there. The youth arena, so to speak, they don't have a compliance officer. And typically, as you know, insurance is the last thing that they want to look at. I mean, it's not fun and it's not sexy, but we go in and we take a risk management approach. Say, okay, what are you doing now? And what are your models for the youth association? And what are you doing? Are we doing field checks? Are you walking the fields for look at potholes? The simple things that maybe a general agent may not do, we take that to heart to say, what is every risk that you may have as a youth organization? We look at what they're doing, we listen. I mean, we try to be really good listeners. And then from there, we say, okay, here are the 3 risk management approaches that we see that we can assist by implementing some simple measures that may not cost anything. And you need to implement XYZ to make sure that the students or the participants are safe and you all are safe as an organization. And there are a lot of different layers that go into that. But it's listening, it's educating, and again, communicating and getting information, what they have from an association, and disseminating that to the parents through that association. Is let the parents know what is out there. Let them know what you are doing.
Yeah.
And we found that's helped quite a bit from our approach to our special risk and youth associations.
Sports are in full swing 24/7, which means athletes are bound to get injured. Injury-Free is a software platform used by youth sports organizations and schools that was developed to help coaches, parents, and administrators communicate injuries that occur and ensure a safe return to play. These sports safety networks are essential for sports teams working to provide the safest possible environment for their families. For more information or to schedule a demo, please visit www.injurefree.com. That's www.injurefree.com.
And it's never ending, right? I mean, you've got a lot of turnover, I would say, or maybe not in certain industries, but a lot of these directors come and go. The organization boards certainly rotate, but then you've got new parents entering these organizations with their young kids coming in every time. So that's a constant drum that you've got to bang to make sure that you stay on top of what's happening in a traditionally an industry that's not necessarily known for its innovation. I mean, insurance can be, it's been around a long time, but it is a constant message as far as resources and impact. So I guess in that relationship, in a lot of ways, having an outsourced specialist in this field, to your point, there's no compliance. There's not somebody who's dedicated to this position, nor do they have the know-how in most cases. So it really is being an outsourced partner to help, understand their inner workings, and then what's the right fit? How do these layers work together to best protect the organizations and the families?
Agree 100%. I mean, there are a lot of different things that they're working with. Insurance is one of them, other vendors with facilities and the fields. And our approach is we just try to be an extension of that association or that youth league. We entrench ourselves of learning what their hazards may be. And we go from there. And if you can truly try to be that extension and understand their model and what they're doing and living in their world, which is what I think the three of us do, is then you can truly start to dissect their mission and what their concerns may be from, again, a risk management approach, protecting the kids, protecting the associations. And there is a lot of great information out there. I mean, you talk about resources. There is unbelievable information on concussion resources that are free. There's really good information on the EAP programs that are out there, whether it's the thermal bulbs that are out there, whether it's the AEDs that are out there. We work with the National Federation of State High School Associations, as you mentioned, and they are the governing body for all high school sports that are across the country. There's so much information on that site, from the concussions to heat and exhaustion, risk management, coaches and officials. So we try to promote the free resources that may be out there that they can latch onto. That's not going to cost them anything, but they can provide that resource. And then again, from a risk management approach, is okay, what are we doing? Do you have athletic trainers? I mean, that comes into a big play in what we deal with across the country. By the way, March is National Athletic Trainer Month. Shout out to all of our athletic trainers in college and high school, because they do an unbelievable job with what they do. But you look at really what does that emergency action plan look like for a youth league or a high school association or a professional team? I mean, you look at, and I'm getting off on a tangent here because I'm very passionate about our trainers, but look what happened in the NFL with Damar Hamlin and that emergency action plan that was in place. Those trainers knew exactly what to do in a short amount of time, and you try to map that out. Whether that happens and those trainers are on there, you're at a baseball game and you get a foul ball that rips it down the third base line and hits a child. Well, there is an action plan that's in place by that Major League Baseball team to tackle that. Same with high school and youth sports, is educating them is, okay, we try to think of what's the worst case scenario. Youth Little League game, a ball goes off the bat and rips through the dugout. We've seen it. It hits a player. What do we have in place for an emergency action plan for that specific scenario? Is there an athletic trainer on site to help that young participant? High school, they're really diligent about their trainers. Some high schools don't have an athletic trainer at every site.
Yeah.
And
we're
so
looking at
again,
what, 60%. I mean, it's we covered this on a couple different other episodes as well, where we don't have enough athletic trainers to even cover all of the youth sports in America, even if we wanted to. There's not enough bodies. But even in the high school level, where it's a much smaller population compared to youth sports, there aren't the requirements to have these types of professionals, when minutes and seconds can be life-saving in those instances, right? So that's a great topic too. I mean, we've seen a lot of research recently about that. Talk about how insurance carriers, when you're underwriting risk and you look at these, you're listening to a new organization and they're telling you all of the things they do, the safety mechanisms, the EAPs, all of those types of things. How does that weigh with a carrier during underwriting? How much influence does having an athletic trainer mean to an insurance premium, or the way that insurance carriers assess risk within an organization?
Yeah, that's a great question. And each carrier has a different philosophy. They're all different. They have different appetites towards the youth sports and what we try to cover and insure. But really, at the end of the day, it's important. They want to see that that the waivers are in place. Number one, to protect that risk from a liability side. More so from the accident medical side is okay. What are we doing? Is there concussion protocol in place? Is there a handbook in place as to what needs to be done? Are we checking the boxes for the EAPs and what they're doing? So a carrier will look at all of the proactive approach that may be in place. But really, Charlie, at the end of the day, the carriers are looking at the losses.
Yeah.
They're looking at the actual injuries, what's been paid out. So we're looking at the losses and the injuries, and then preventive measure is key. But the carriers want to know, okay, what is the risk? You know, when we look at a rugby or a football, that's certainly different than a youth baseball association or a youth golf camp. I mean, you're looking at two different sides of the paradigm shift there of how we're going to insure them.
Yeah.
So,
I've heard soccer too, right? There's a concern around concussions in soccer from the carrier perspective.
you know, they used to, yes, Charlie, that is correct. I mean, soccer has become a high risk sport. There is a lot of contact. It's a great game. Love that my kids played it, but there are more injuries now in soccer, and concussions are certainly a part of that. So when you look at the different risks, a carrier will say, okay, I'm going to rate based on football or rugby and that rate of concussion versus a golf or a tennis, where you're not going to see a ton of concussions. There's still a small risk there. So the carriers have an appetite. Certainly like to pool their risks. They'd like football and basketball,
Right.
and tennis and golf to be pooled together when they can. But if it's a youth rugby league, that is going to flag the carrier, say, okay, high risk, a lot of injuries, concussions are going to be there. We're going to take that into account based on their waiver procedure, their
Yeah.
concussion protocol. Do they have trainers on site at each game? We certainly know probably not practice. We would hope so, but we all know as these youth leagues, it's a dad or it's a volunteer. And so that goes back to the risk management approaches. Okay, what are you going to
Right.
do if there's a concussion during practice
What's the training?
with the training? So the carriers take all of that into account, but at the end of the day, they're looking at the loss ratios and how much a carrier may pay out versus what they are charging in that premium coming in the door.
So if we see and that makes sense. So if we see, let's say we have two different scenarios. We've got an organization that's doing what they can, and to your point, maybe they're following the federal state requirements for those compliance, those trainings. They're checking those boxes. They have those pieces in play. Still high risk, a rugby, a football, something like that. And then you've got another organization who isn't doing those things.
Yeah.
Where does it come down to? Will an insurance carrier still offer coverage to the organization who doesn't have the same level of, say, proactive preventative measures, or will they just not write the risk? You know, is there, and what I'm getting at, is there a benefit to doing all of these things short term? If I'm checking the boxes, or if I'm going above and beyond as a youth sport organization, does that give me a discount on my insurance? Or is it the other side of the coin, where if I don't do these things that are mandated, then I just can't get insurance anywhere?
Yeah, I would say, you know, number one, the carriers are very aware of these risks that are out there. They are reading the papers, they are seeing the injuries. A lot of times we will get, you know, a ping from one of our carriers. Hey, did you see this concussion suit or accident in California or Kansas? And they're very aware. And so we tend to stick to those carriers that understand youth sports, high school sports, college sports. There are not a ton that are out there that understand it and will rate on those specific risks. But to your point, 100%, if you have an organization on the youth level that is implementing a risk management approach, they have their waiver and enrollment process down, they have their concussion protocols down, they're engaging trainers, they absolutely look at that and say, okay, this association, they have their stuff together. To whereas we will see some that have no risk management approach, They don't have a concussion protocol. They don't have a handbook, and yet they want insurance. A lot of times those carriers will say, you know what? It doesn't look like it's very organized. That's a lawsuit waiting to come from a parent. We don't want to get involved with that risk, and they will pass. And that, as a broker, that's where we are fighting for the insureds at the end of the day. But it's hard to go back to a carrier and say, hey, take a risk on these associations when they don't have their protocols, they don't have the procedures. When you have liability of $3 or $5 million, it's hard to talk to a carrier about taking on their risk when the association doesn't want to spend that time to put those measures and those protocols in place. Right?
So it's proactive. I mean, so it benefits organizations who take this approach, but don't expect an immediate return. It's going to come after 3, 4, 5 years of a plan and policy being active and in place, where on the backside, you'll see reduced frequency or maybe even severity. Severity, you can't really do anything about, right? You'll have every, couple few years, a serious type of injury, a catastrophic type of injury, but maybe frequency you can dial back. And your claim loss history then ultimately, which affects your premium costs, that will go down based off of these preventative measures. Or is it more liability protection in case a suit's filed? How do you see those preventative measures positively impacting the association's risk or risk profile?
Yeah, well, it's on both, Charlie. Number one, and when you talk frequency versus severity, the frequency is going to be on the accident medical piece. So that's number one. And yes, an organization that is engaged in preventive measures is going to be looked at much differently, as we talked about. So you're doing the upfront measures, you are putting those protocols into place. That's going to lower your premiums because hopefully your loss history and your loss ratios will benefit that down the road. And you will see that if you have the measures in place. Ultimately, when you have the back end, and it all comes down to the data, right? It comes down to the claims data and what they're looking at for those losses, but it also comes down to the preventive measures. Say, okay, when you have a concussion, how are you storing that data? What are you doing to look at the data on your concussions, on your ACLs, on your labral repairs, whatever it may be? The data is power. Data is king. So when you have that and you're looking at it and you're being proactive to say, okay, we are looking at concussion data. We're looking at what's happening. Is it during a practice versus a competition or a game? Is it a level 4 concussion, brain bleed versus a slight concussion or a level 1? So when you're doing that, it's going to, in fact, definitely impact the accident medical because you're taking that data and that's what the carrier is looking at. And so if your losses are going down by your proactive measures, that's going to help your premium 3 or 4 years down the road. If you're not doing that, that leads into the liability of the overall association itself. If those measures are not in place and you're not proactively looking at your injuries, you're not putting measures in place to prevent those injuries, which can be done. Again, severity you can't control. But then that comes down to the liability of the association itself. What are they doing to impact those? Because that's when those measures aren't in place and you don't have concussion protocol or you don't have a waiver and release protocol, then that is going to lead to litigation against that association.
It's funny. It's almost a full circle to why insurance can be difficult to understand, because it seems like the benefits side of insurance are long term. You've got to have a longer proactive mindset before you start seeing those positive impacts. But the negative impact can be immediate if you don't have it, which is almost flip what our society, is trained to. I want instant gratification, right? I'm getting a deal when I sign up for this, so I go in this direction. That's the immediate benefit of doing something. But it seems almost opposite and counterintuitive to that thinking, because you're immediately at risk if you don't do these things. So it's almost like get on the tracks, stay on the tracks, continue to look at ways to improve. Long term, you're going to have a solid foundation to your organization if you have a positive risk management plan in place. And that's how, from a financial impact with insurance, but also from a liability and risk standpoint.
Absolutely. And it goes back to your initial point is when you are doing these things and being proactive, you are helping your claims and your loss experience, but you're also showing those carriers that we are invested. We are taking the necessary steps so we can get insurance, because there are associations that can't. And if you are needing that insurance, it's important for the kids, it's helping the association, then a carrier is much more likely to say, yes, we believe in what they're doing and we will offer an insurance solution, whether it's accident medical, whether it's general liability, whether it's catastrophic for those severity instances, whether it's the directors and officers protecting those youth association executive directors. They have a lot on their plates. They're being pulled in a ton of directions, and insurance, as we mentioned, is the last on their plates. Well, when they're making those decisions for the direction of that association, that directors and officers insurance is extremely important to protect them as individuals as they are guiding that association. So yeah, it's a muddy pool. There's a lot that these executive directors are doing and don't even know that they're at risk a lot of times. And yes, preventive measures and a risk management approach is absolutely what we preach from the top down. And then it leads to that education and communication.
Yeah. I got to ask too. So, you've seen a lot, right? This is 20 years. Congrats, by the way, since 2003. You've been doing this.
Thank you.
What is one of the biggest eye-opening face palm to type of situation where you've heard this association say, we're looking for insurance, and you start asking them the questions and you're listening and you're just absolutely dumbfounded that the safety measures aren't in place, or something that's just so off the wall crazy? What's something that sticks out in your head over the years that you're just shocked that this is an organization that's offering sports for youth kids?
Well, it was the concussions to start with. I mean, that was number one. That you would talk to an association that, well, if they had coverage, Charlie, that was the no-brainer. We saw a lot of associations that were offering nothing, and that raises red flags for both the kids and the parents, but the associations itself. So when they had nothing, we're like, that's not good. And then when you look at an association that maybe doesn't have a waiver, they just wouldn't have a waiver. And that's a huge red flag as well. So when we saw many of those decades ago, we're like, you have to change the way that you are interacting with the parents and the kids. Because we saw no coverage in place. We saw the frequency of concussions increasing rapidly. And then you saw no waiver in place to protect the organization. That it was mind-boggling that you talk to these executive directors, and a lot of times there was nothing in place. And they're doing the right thing. They're trying to provide an outlet for these children and these youth participants, and they're 100% in for the right reasons. And they either don't have the money because they can't afford it, which we understand, but offering nothing opens up a lot of those can of worms that you really don't think about day to day, which should be in their train of thoughts for covering these kids. So concussions, no coverage; waivers, no coverage. That was what we saw. Is like, how are you running an organization and not having these things in place?
Yeah.
Not many youth sports administrators began their careers with the dream of negotiating insurance rates. Most have a love and passion for the game and saw it as a way to inspire the next generation of youth athletes. However, nowadays, insurance can be the single greatest cost for a youth sports organization. At American Sports Insurance Services, we've done the work for you and created the single most comprehensive youth sports insurance program on the market. We did it by aggregating the largest youth sports injury database in the world. Let us do the heavy lifting and represent you for all your risk management needs. For more information or to get a quote, visit www.getamsis.com. That's www.getamsis.com.
Christian, to flip the coin, a lot of the sports that we see nowadays are evolving, one, in the way that the sports themselves are played, the way that the injury management and injury recovery processes are handled. Do you see that there's a sport that does the opposite, that's actually at the forefront of how injury management and prevention should be, actually handled, because you see that you're talking about the mismanagement where there are groups that don't have insurance to offer or don't have coverages, but is there one that really kind of is pushing the boundaries and saying you guys need to catch up to us?
That's a great question, Justin. I think, on many different levels, it's so different from the college and university where they have a large staff. They are doing the right things. Every sport is being extremely progressive on preventive measure. High school associations they're doing a great job in what they can do. But from a sport perspective, you look at your high risk sports, and football obviously is leading that way. When you look at um, the collision nature of football, what are they doing for concussion management? And you have that from the NFL protocols down to college, down to the youth sports, down to the Pop Warners, USA Football, the safety guidelines, the resources that they have. They're always going to be in the forefront because they get the most attention. Um, Soccer has certainly been on the rise and had done a nice job of implementing what needs to be done. On the youth side, you see a lot of organizations with young girls soccer not allowing them to do headers until they get into the middle school, and the protective measures that they're putting into place. So soccer's done a good job. Rugby has done a good job. Not that that's on the collegiate or high school level team sport, but the youth associations, you're seeing a lot of progressive measures on rugby. But you look at the claims that we see, you'd be really surprised that we see a lot of concussion claims in volleyball and women's basketball. So, Justin, I know it doesn't answer your question, but it just depends on the level. It depends on the resources that are behind them. And then it comes down to, nationally, what are those sports doing to promote injury prevention, concussion prevention, and awareness? Because, with what we're seeing now across the country with high school associations, you're seeing a lot of class action suits, whether it's due to injuries, whether it's due to liability. So all of these sports are now being forced, because they are so rapidly growing, is to take a look at what are we doing to protect these students and these youth participants all the way around. You get into the injuries, obviously, is what we deal with, but you look at the social awareness about sexual abuse and molestation. What are our associations doing to protect our kids from the sexual predators that are unfortunately that are out there? It's real. And protecting them both from a day-to-day practice and participation, but that also goes back onto the liability. Whatever association that is out there is, what are the sexual abuse and molestation practices that are out there to protect these kids?
You kind of touched on, Christian, about how there are those differences between, what you can do from a collegiate level and at the high school level. So for you guys as an insurance company, could you give us just a little bit of insight on the differences it is for you guys to insure a youth athletic and high school level sport versus a collegiate program?
College is much different, and to be a good standing NCAA member, there are guidelines that they have to have insurance. So when you take concussions, that's going to be included in the intercollegiate policy as we provide it now, to our 250 members. High school associations, that's kind of a different beast when you talk about what's going to be in place, as far as the coverage goes, down to the youth members. And when you talk about the insurance on a state high school association, you work from the top down. You have the executive directors that are working with the school districts and the superintendents, and you're worried about that catastrophic high school claim, from an association level. How do we make sure that every student athlete is covered catastrophically, right? And a lot of that information is disseminated to the member institutions to make sure that they are doing what they need to do, because a lot of that responsibility will fall on the member institutions. And so when you look at that, Justin, is where you start to talk about, okay, are we talking about a catastrophic claim? in what is provided and what can be provided, how a carrier looks at that. Is it an accident medical on the frequency side? Is it a liability side where you have third party liability where an official is running down the field, breaks his leg or breaks his neck because they weren't maintaining the field, and there is a huge hole on the football field? Well, that's a liability to the association or the member institution from not walking the field, looking at those fields and guidelines and what those high school players, what the officials are going through. And then on youth sports, from a carrier's perspective, it is what is in place. It is what's being done to prevent these risks, and what is being done to then, from a carrier standpoint, is how do we manage that catastrophically, liability wise, protecting the association from a directors and officers side. So Justin, they are very, very different, but it just depends on that level of what we're trying to ensure and how they go about, and how a carrier will look at that individually from all three different levels that we insure.
Customized approaches. And I'm glad you brought up the background checks. I want to bring that back for a point real fast. I want to ask you a question. Then I want to bring it back up to the macro level. When you talk about background checks in the sexual abuse and molestation as a preventative measure, what's something how do carriers look at the different types of checks, right? So we've got our state level $5 checks. We've got our county level, or, smaller regional components that are in that $15 range. And you've got your $35 type of national plans. How do carriers respond to three different levels, or do they at all?
Yeah. Well, that relates to more of the high school association side, and looking at, these carriers now, because of what's happened with USA Gymnastics, water polo, Michigan State. This has really been the driver to the sexual abuse and molestation, which has changed those markets. That used to be a add-on to insurance, and now these carriers are saying, okay, I want to see your sexual abuse and molestation protocols. I want to see it within your handbook. And then it goes down to, statutorily, they're different. One state may be completely different with their regulations and their guidelines. Some state associations may accept every 3 years. Some put it back onto the member institutions because they are the ones that are hiring these coaches. They may do it each and every year. Obviously, from a risk management standpoint, we say every year is great. And we would drive for that. Some say we're going to do it 3 years. We can't control the level, Charlie, to your point, and say, okay, I'm going to do the $15, it's the basic, or I'm going to do a deeper dive and do the $22 background check and make that our mandatory scenario here, because it can get very difficult. You have a coach or an official that maybe has a record of not being an outstanding citizen and has a past where they've been in some litigation with sexual abuse and molestation. Well, they're in one state, and that official transfers and moves to a different state, and they haven't done a background check in that state. Well, that national governing body, they were covered in that other state. Well, they now are not officiating in that state, go to a new state, and that state has no idea that they have been in that scenario, and they haven't checked yet. So the checks and balances for these background checks, especially in sexual abuse and molestation, are paramount to these associations moving forward. Unfortunately, that's the environment that we're living in now. We always strongly recommend whatever it is they can afford to do a yearly background check on coaches, officials, administration. It all plays a part.
Yeah, anybody who has contact with the children, right? You want to make sure that you're getting them screened as much as possible. And at a much different level, this is a kind of a question that comes up again on a number of one of these episodes, is that U.S. is different when we talk about sports and their structure. I mean, it seems like in our country, there is no central agency. There's no sport national governing body that oversees everything in our country. Unlike other foreign countries where you do have a department within the government, right? And so these regulations then come from a top-down source that say, listen, basic principles, we're going to set these rules inside of what you guys are doing, have at it. But here's the basic principle about, these are the mainstay standards. And it almost seems like in the US, these different layers of administration, the national governing bodies, NFHS, you've got your state high school athletic associations, then you've got your districts and individual schools within the districts, right? It's almost set up to diffuse the liability in a way. Who is ultimately responsible when an organization isn't doing what they're supposed to be doing? Where does that buck stop? And in a lot of ways, it feels like that ecosystem is what causes some of the confusion around insurance, or at least maybe opens up the door for some of these questionable practices, if you will, on how do organizations make decisions. But maybe speak a little bit about how you feel that in our governmental structure in the US, how that may either help or hinder youth sports from an insurance perspective.
Yeah, I think that because it is not a uniform approach across the United States, when something happens like, again, USA Gymnastics or water polo, that puts it in the forefront. So that specific sport will start to make those changes. Now, USA water polo or youth soccer, whatnot, they may have a completely different approach. So you have those that are being proactive because of the nature of what's happened. But there are different injury management systems. There are different risk management assessments. And so until you have the uniformity, it's going to be very different. And it all comes back to, okay, what is that organization doing as a national governing body, a state high school association? Where does that buck stop? What is considered a sanctioned and supervised event with a high school association that they have kids playing in AAU and all their club teams, which is a huge challenge for the associations right now with injuries. And when did it happen? Was it on the club circuit? Was it during a high school sport? So until you do, it really comes down to that association and how they're managing it themselves and protecting their overall risk with an approach that says, okay, we are responsible for these kids with this association and these events, and this is how we're going to do it. We're going to layer it from the top down. We're going to have all of our bases covered from every aspect of it is liability, accident, directors and officers, and you disseminate that from the organization top down so they're insuring themselves. Because if USA Rugby is doing something different than USA Football, they're not going to be speaking to each other. So while their protocols may be the same in trying to take care of the kid, their risk management approach may be completely different in what they are doing to ensure that organization.
And do you see that as a benefit, a positive, or potentially we're missing the mark by having 50 different approaches?
Well, I think universally, Charlie, it's hard to have one program nationwide because of the risk of rugby, football versus the other sports. Does a carrier have an appetite to ensure, in high school, 8.2, 8.3 million kids? Would they have an appetite to ensure all of that with a uniform package and policy? They may not want that. And I think at the end of the day, if they're doing it individually and they're taking the right approach to ensuring the kids, then that's all we can do today until legislature or someone steps in and says, this is how we're doing it. This is what our government is saying we have to do, whether it's concussion guidelines, heat exhaustion guidelines. Until we have that, you have to communicate and educate your association on what they need to do to protect themselves day in and day out. And that's what they rely on people like us for, people like you for, is what is out there for our association, because we're not getting the guidelines from the government. We're not having uniform approach from our governing body of baseball, soccer, football. So until you have that, you just need some people that are very passionate about what they do, that understand and live day to day. Unfortunately, the insurance is, again, not fun, the last thing they think about, but is having a partner that understands what they do and understands the insurance landscape of every risk that could take place. People don't want to hear about it. We think of worst case scenario, and then we'll take care of the easy stuff right after. The ankles, the concussions,
Right.
we have all that. But really the long-term approach is, what is your overall greatest risk, and how do we tackle that by the specific association?
Yeah, knowing your blind spots, right? You got to know where you're at your weakest and make sure those areas are covered.
Absolutely.
Hi, my name is Charlie Wund, and I'm the CEO and founder of the Agency for Student Health Research. When I started the company over a decade ago, I aimed to help reduce injuries within youth sports. Since then, Injure Free was created as a risk management software platform and has grown to become one of the leading injury reporting platforms used by thousands of athletic organizations and schools nationwide. Our expansive education library and reporting technology provides the tools administrators need to take the pain out of risk management. As a former high school athletic director and youth sports organizer, I understand the regulatory compliance requirements and need for individual accountability. Our goal is to provide a service that does better than checking the box. For more information or to schedule a demo, please visit www.injurefree.com. That's www.injurefree.com. Well, we've got a couple other questions for you. We like to sign off with here as we close up on these episodes. I think, given your level of expertise, what's that one piece of advice that you feel would blanket, any kind of approach towards risk management in sports? What's that number one piece of advice that you think you'd offer?
Oh man, that's a hard one. There's so much out there today. But I think if you're talking about that number one risk, is knowing what that risk is.
Yeah.
Educating yourselves by talking to those, as far as coverage goes, is what are our greatest risks as a youth association, as a high school association, and what is out there, what is in the weeds, and really diving into it. Because if our associations are not doing risk assessments, which is
Right.
what we help our associations do, we help our youth programs do, is you need to do a risk assessment. And I know it's hard each year because the staff is not there, there's turnover, but really it's going in and having the resources to say, okay, here's what we know about your association. Are you doing a risk assessment? So you know your risk and you're not being reactive. A proactive approach is always the best way. And we believe it, we live it. So I would say number one is risk assessments and knowing what your approach needs to be, because you need to know what you don't know.
Yeah, that's good. I love that. And then I guess the last question for you then, on a personal level, something in youth sports, or if you look at the larger landscape of, I guess, sports in the United States, what's one thing that you would change if you could just snap your fingers?
Oh my gosh. That you're going to end on that one, Charlie? That's a stumper right there. It's really difficult because you have thoughts on football, thoughts on tackle football with kids. My 4 kids and my son played freshman football this year. Do you let them tackle before high school? Do you let them play Pop Warner and put in that risk? I'd have to think about that when you got me on the spot there. But I think one thing would either come down to the concussion coverage and taking care of these student athletes that are sustaining concussions, and the return to play, the return to school, and or sexual abuse and molestation guidelines. There are a lot of young athletes that are in youth sports, high school sports, college sports. You never want to see those instances come about. So I think we need to see some dramatic change on how we handle that from an association, from a sexual abuse and molestation level.
Yeah.
So those two, I
one.
think it's not one, but it's the two that I see in youth, high school, and college sports is something that we need to tackle immediately that can be enhanced from what is there. Because there are a lot of good things, and a lot of people don't understand the college model, the high school model, and the youth model. There are so many great things that are going on that fans and parents just don't understand what's going on behind the scenes. And I think there can be a lot of other education that goes on with those protocols in place.
Love it. Sharing all the good stuff, right? Let's make sure we talk about how we're making changes, making sure people are part of the process, informed about it. And that makes you feel good as a parent. I mean, when you see an organization that says, listen, we're actively working to improve on these areas, I mean, that's where I want my kids to be. You can't be with them every second of the day, right? So we've got to at some point let them go on their own, and you can educate them, but putting them in good environments is another key step for parents, and they always look for those sorts of things. So
Yeah, no, I agree. You can't control the claims, you can't control the injuries. All you can do is, have the coverage there. Make sure that you're speaking to your executive directors, and you knock on wood and you light your candle. You don't need the insurance coverage, but as
right.
long as that plan is there, they're in good hands.
Love it. We appreciate you taking some time today. It's always a pleasure, my friend. And we expect to hear you on some Little League broadcasts at some point down the road, something along those lines. We got to get you back onto the mic.
But I definitely have the face for radio. So always a friend to you, Charlie. I appreciate you, Justin. If we're on video, I'd give you a forkum and say, go Devils. Always a pleasure to interact with our Devil Nation. So I appreciate you guys having me on. Wonderful discussions. Anything we can do to be proactive to help these associations, we're in 100%.
We would like to thank you all for listening to today's episode of the Safety Goals podcast, presented by Injury Free. I'm your host, Justin Torres, and a big thanks to our special guest. And also, thanks to my co-host, Charlie Wund. To listen to other episodes of the Safety Goals podcast, check us out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.